Hi, everyone. Welcome to the special pre-children's week chat and panel discussion. I'm Bruce Leslie, president of First Focus on Children. We're currently streaming live on June 12th on the eve of our third annual Children's Week, a week where advocates across the country amplify the issues most important to our nation's children and call on our children's lawmakers to act in the best interest of the child. Today, we'll be talking about how budget gaps negatively impact children with a panel of experts from the National Education Association, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and Share Our Strength. But first, we're extremely grateful and happy to welcome Senator from the great state of Maryland, who is named a champion for children for all his tremendous work on kids' issues, Senator Chris Van Hollen from Maryland. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator.
Well, Bruce, thank you, and thank all of the folks who are tuning in today, and especially thank you to First Focus on Children for all that you do to shine a light on the budget issues. And as you have pointed out many times, Bruce, and your organization, our budgets are moral documents. They reflect our priorities as a society. And at this moment where we really need to be pushing forward to invest more in our kids, unfortunately, our budget does not adequately reflect that. We are obviously all in a very difficult time in our country with COVID-19. And of course, we're also at a moment in our history where I hope we recognize that we need to address some of the deep systemic issues that have been, embedded in our society. Everything from the need to deal with police accountability to focusing on our kids' education and budgets that, in my view, historically have not reflected the needs of minority communities of color. And we need to address that on a systemic basis. And if you look at the numbers, and I want to thank you all for your budget analyses, because they really do help provide us with a blueprint. I also want to thank you because there's so many folks lobbying in Washington for big money special interests. It's really important to have a group dedicated to making sure we invest in our kids and their future and our joint future. But as your analysis has indicated, the poverty rate for children is almost 55% higher than it is for adults. And yet at the same time, we spend just over 7% of our overall budget on children, and that's declined over the years as a share of our budget. It was still too low, but it was at 10% in fiscal year 2015. So we are headed in the wrong direction when it comes to focusing our budget on investing in our children. So what I thought I would do is just outline a couple of the key areas and then look forward to your questions. And First Focus on Children has outlined many of these. I mean, we have the Medicaid CHIPS program. We have the child nutrition and food programs. We have education investments, and we have income support programs. So let me just quickly go through those and, again, highlight the importance of those existing programs, but also the threats they face and the additional work that we need to do. Let me start with Medicaid and CHIP, because Medicaid and CHIP provide essential health care to 35 million children in our country. They pay for about half of the births in the United States. And we know from many, many studies that investment in Medicaid and healthcare for our kids does pay important dividends in terms of better educational opportunities and higher income later in life. And it makes sense. If you don't get the healthcare you need as a child, you're going to pay the consequences, and all of us will pay those consequences. And unfortunately, despite the clear evidence showing that these Medicaid and CHIP investments are important, we see a continued assault on programs. This is not a partisan statement, it's a statement of fact. I mean, Republicans have been trying to cut Medicaid significantly. The Trump budget tries to cut it significantly. They've not been successful with direct cuts, but then they tried other efforts to undermine it, including block granting the program in ways that actually limit the amounts that go to Medicaid and CHIP. Proposed rules trying to make it harder for states to finance their share of Medicaid, and in some cases giving states the authority to increase premiums on already low-income families in order to access the health care. And finally, the issue of work requirements imposed in a way that would mean that kids are going to suffer, because we know that when parents don't have access to health care, it also diminishes the access for the kids. So we need to continue to fight back these cuts to Medicaid and the CHIPS program, and look forward to your continued help there. Food assistance, the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has highlighted the importance of this program, and we actually, need to be boosting our efforts here as more and more people have lost their jobs. And we made some important additions in the CARES Act. The HEROES Act that passed the House contains some additional important measures. But the SNAP program delivers more nutrition assistance to low-income children than any other federal program. Nearly 20 million children can afford an adequate diet because of the CHIPS program. We do need to do more, and the maximum SNAP benefit is increased by 15% in the HEROES Act, and it also increases the monthly minimum SNAP benefit from $16 to $30 for all households. We need to push hard for these changes in the United States Senate. As you know, right now, Senator McConnell is dragging his feet, both in timing of the legislation as well as the substance of the legislation. So we need to keep the pressure on from all parts of the country. In addition to the SNAP program, of course, there's the school meal program. And this has also been very important. States like Maryland have set up and designated a number of their schools where families can come receive these meals as part of their overall diet and ability to essentially get by during these difficult times. So in addition to the SNAP program, we want to continue with both the child nutrition program and the emergency food programs as well. Let me just turn quickly to education and both IDEA and Title I. These are, of course, investments that are essential to the success of our kids. And the federal government is falling way short of its commitments. When it comes to special ed, the promise had been that the federal government would pay 40% of the costs. As of today, we're at about 15%, a little below 15% our share of the costs. Just to give you an idea of what the magnitude of the dollars is in the area of Title I, if you look at what the Congress is actually appropriating compared to what the authorization levels are, which were determined based on what the real need is, we are falling short by $33 billion a year on Title I, which between 2005 and 2017 amounted to almost $350 billion in shortfall. So this is why I introduced and have for many years a bill called the Keep Our Pact Act. That stands for Keep Our Promises to America's Children and Teachers Act, which would do two things. Number one, it would mandate funding for both IDA and Title I. My view is this is an essential part of our budget. We need to mandate it, and so it's not subject to the annual whims of the appropriations process. That's really important. And second, it would, over a period of 10 years, make sure that we hit the target, the required levels for both the federal commitment to IDA and to Title I. And if you look around the country, we know that many of our schools, especially in high poverty areas, are desperate in terms of this additional help, and we need to provide it. This is going to be a top priority. I'm pleased that the Democratic presidential candidates, almost all of them, co-sponsored this legislation. I know NEA is going to be represented on this call. I want to thank them and the other organizations on this call for their focus on making sure we get this funding for our kids' education. A part of our kids' education that has been highlighted even more in terms of the gaps during this pandemic has been the issue of distance learning. We called it the homework gap. Now that we're depending on distance learning for even more hours of instruction, we're talking about not just the homework gap, but learning throughout the day. Long before the pandemic hit, I'd introduced legislation to close this homework gap, to close the distance learning gap. And we're going to push very hard, as part of the next round of legislation, emergency legislation, to address this issue. This is an issue in urban areas, in rural areas, and in suburban areas. Access to the internet. There are three components to this. One is you need a device, you need a tablet, you need a computer. Number two, you need the connection. And number three, you need an affordable plan. And so we want to address all those. The House HEROES Act does have $1.5 billion dedicated to helping with this issue. I've introduced legislation with Ed Markey that would increase that further. And we're going to be pushing for that as part of the next round as well. Let me just close with some of the other important issues regarding having an essential income for families with children. And I'm pleased to be a co-sponsor of legislation that was introduced by Senator Michael Bennet on the American Families Act, which would expand the child tax credit. It would essentially make sure that low-income families with children would receive a child tax credit from $2,000 to $3,000 in that range, and for families with children under 6, $3,600. This is essential help for families with kids to help address that child poverty challenge that we continue to face in this country, which is a stain on our country. And we look forward to working with you to push that as well. One final bill that we're working on that I want to mention, and I think it's come to your attention, has to do with the child support pass-through. Right now, for families who are on TANF, they have to essentially assign their child support benefit to state governments and the federal government. Our view is that the families should receive the benefit of those child support payments. It is important as part of the TANF program, in my view, to try to ensure that those payments are made. We want, in most cases, we're talking about fathers. We want to make sure fathers are supporting their children, but we want those child support payments to come to the children. And we're going to be working on legislation to address that. And I know that you're involved with that as well, Bruce, and the organization. So let me end there. We got a lot of work to do, as we know. This is, I believe, a moment in our country, especially as we come up to the November elections, where we're going to make fundamental choices regarding our future and what our budget looks like. And for all of us who are determined to invest more in our kids and really reduce and eliminate child poverty, this is really a moment where we have to work harder than ever. So thank you for being part of that, and look forward to your questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Senator, I think you just highlighted exactly why you're such a great champion for children for us. Just to tell a little bit of the history of our children's budget work, but also why we created a Children's Budget Coalition is that for many years, we had seen, going back to the Bush administration, for example, there's one budget where he talked about, we're really great. I'm really great because I did this thing. I increased funding for Head Start. But when we kind of looked at the analysis, we looked at all the different issues where there were actually cuts. And as you know, President Trump, the share of spending for kids has declined the last few years. But President Trump would have eliminated 44 programs for kids and cut the share of spending by billions of dollars, the amount of money for kids by billions of dollars. And as you highlighted, whether it's Medicaid or education programs or child nutrition programs, just fundamentally across the board. And so I guess my first question is, what you're such a great champion, and what's awesome about your opening is you recognize the whole child. You recognize that if we're going to improve the well-being of kids in this country, we've got to improve their health care, their nutrition, their education, lift them out of poverty. What advice do you have for us in the children's community about how we can help you make that case and to really kind of change the way we sort of think about kids and really value them in the budget, appropriations, and tax code as we move forward?
Well, and again, thank you for what you're already doing. And you mentioned Head Start, and I also do want to emphasize, in addition to the K through 12 budget issues like special ed and Title I, we need to beef up our investment in Head Start, in early childhood education, and of course, childcare, affordable quality access to childcare is a big piece of that. Look, this is really what elections are all about, and I think that's why it's important that everybody be supporting candidates who recognize the need to make these investments in our kids instead of those who keep, pushing for tax cuts for wealthy people in our country and big corporations, because unfortunately, that's what we saw back in 2017. We saw a big tax cut that will result in a $2 trillion addition to the deficit over the next 10 years. And that's not my number, that's the Congressional Budget Office number. And that's after factoring in any potential economic growth from that tax cut. And so we need to highlight these different priorities with the voters. I mean, do you want to provide another round of tax breaks to people who don't need them, or do you want to make sure that we invest in our kids and use the tax code to help families with children who need to be lifted out of poverty? And so I really think that organization, advocacy, getting involved. Again, this isn't a partisan statement. This is just getting involved in support of candidates that understand the importance of these priorities is the way to go. Let me just say, with respect to the bill that I mentioned earlier, the Keep Our Pact Act, by making that funding stream mandatory, it would protect it in many ways from annual budget cuts and the whim. Whether or not we had a particular budget cap on discretionary spending, because right now we're living in this world, of course, of budget caps, although they will expire soon. But if you're just looking at this coming fiscal year, for example, while we were able to raise the budget caps a little bit, the Trump administration and Republicans are pushing to use that increase. Well, first of all, there's not to be too much in the weeds here, but anyway, there's the VA Missions Act, which is legislation we all support to help our veterans. But the administration is arguing that a lot of this additional money will go toward Homeland Security. So we have a big battle on our hands, and we need to also make sure that we change this balance, in my view, between the amount of money we put in defense. We obviously need a robust budget for national defense, but right now the defense budget consumes over 50% of discretionary spending, and that doesn't include other national security related expenditures like the Homeland Security budget. So we have a lot of work to do. We have to win this argument. The argument will be made during elections.
Yeah. You totally anticipated my other question, which was I was going to ask you about the budget cap. So, and I think that you perfectly made the point about all the work we need to do to sort of really make the case for sort of changing our priorities in this country and really raising up kids as a something that we need to lift up and make do better by. We are failing kids and all the ways that you mentioned, and we really, I just want to thank you for all the great work you do to really promote kids in the Senate. You're right now in the minority of that, but you're right. There's elections coming up, but you really, it's I just want to highlight the fact that for our legislative scorecard, the way we do our sort of champions analysis, you're actually put at a disadvantage because appropriations bills are really hard to score in that. There's just one, and then there's people on authorizing committees can offer a bunch of bills and get a lot of points. But what's so incredible about you is not only do you do this amazing work on the appropriations committee, but you're like with the PACT Act and these other pieces of legislation that you work on, and your work even outside the committee, the appropriations committee, but like, you mentioned the Bennett bill and things like that. We just really are grateful to you that you do your day job really well on appropriations, and you fight for kids, but then you step outside and really fight for kids, in sort of your broader context as a senator. And so we just really want to thank you, and thank you for joining us today as we sort of kick off Children's Week. Children's Day is on Sunday, and then we'll have Children's Week next week. But we wanted to start with you because you're such an amazing champion for us. Is there anything else you'd like to add in closing?
Well, thank you for those kind words. Most importantly, though, thank you, Bruce, and First Focus on Children, for all you do to organize around the importance of making these investments. My only parting word would be that we are, of course, in this very difficult time where millions of Americans are now out of work because of the importance of taking the precautions that were taken with respect to social distancing. As I think all of us have seen, the people who are hardest hit, not surprisingly, are those from lower income families. I mean, people are experiencing hardship across the board, but as the chairman of the Federal Reserve remarked the other day, I think it was 40% of people who had jobs earning less than $40,000 a year, 40% are out of work. And that obviously impacts the entire family, including all the kids in all these families. And that's why the HEROES Act that was passed by the House of Representatives weeks ago now is really important, both in terms of extending income support to millions of families who are out of work at an enhanced level, in terms of the food nutrition programs, and I mentioned their increase in SNAP benefits, in terms of their assistance to state and local governments, because to the extent that they end up laying off individuals and cutting services, that has a negative snowballing effect on the entire community. So in the short term, in terms of protecting kids, we really need to push for the Senate to take up and pass the House HEROES Act.
Yeah, we agree 100%, and we stand with you on that, and we'll keep working on that as a community. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We know you're busy, and we appreciate your time and again all the great work you do for our children.
And thank all of you. Take care.
All right, you too. Take care. Again, thanks to Senator Van Hollen, and now I'm happy to welcome my colleague Michelle Dalfior. She's the Senior Vice President for Budget and Tax Policy here at First Focus on Children. And she will be leading our expert panel today to talk about budget and tax issues. Michelle, who do we have joining us?
Thank you, Bruce. That was fantastic. I also want to express a big thank you to Senator Van Hollen for all his leadership and his staff for helping us to make this happen today. I think he just hit on so many important points here, especially at this time when, as he mentioned, we're negotiating another emergency spending package and the annual spending bills are also being considered. So I am thrilled to be welcoming three of our very, very active members of the Children's Budget Coalition who are here today to help sort of leapfrog from the Senator's comments and your comments, Bruce, to talk more about the needs for spending on children, especially now, and especially those low-income communities and communities of color who are being hardest hit by what's happening out there every day, and the uncertainty and the trauma and stress of it all. So I am very pleased to welcome Monica Gonzalez. She is the Associate Director of Government Relations at Share Our Strength, and she's going to take a few minutes to share with us some of her thoughts in the area of nutrition programs for children. So Monica, thank you so much for being here today, and I turn the stage over to you. And then we have, after that, Cory Williams, who is the federal lobbyist for the National Education Association, and Lucy Recio, the Senior Public Policy Advocacy Analyst at the National Association for the Education of Young Children. So thank you all for being here, and Monica, you're up first.
Great, thank you so much. And I really just want to first thank First Focus for bringing us all together here today. And also, more importantly, to thank Senator Van Hollen for being such a great champion for kids. We really need more senators like him to really understand the importance of investing in children. So many thanks to him. I have a few slides, so if we could just bring them up, that would be fantastic. In the meantime, while those slides are loading up, I would like to go ahead and just kind of tell you a little bit about Share Our Strength. Share Our Strength is the organization that is working to help feed children. You've probably heard of our No Kid Hungry campaign, where we work with community partners in schools, in school districts, with nonprofits, and many other stakeholders to help meet the needs of children in low-income communities. We can't do this without the help of many people, and our goal is really to help these partners effectively and efficiently implement the school nutrition programs. We advocate for breakfast after the bell that would ensure that children have the opportunity to eat breakfast in their classroom in a community setting, versus having to go early to school, which comes with its own stigma and challenges, especially for children in low-income families who may have other obligations before arriving to school. So we work really hard with all of our advocates and partners in this space. Right now, what we're really focused on is how we all respond to COVID-19, which has brought so many challenges. I think, as Bruce said earlier, and so did the senator, that this pandemic has revealed so many disparities across the country, and that families of who are low income also families of color have been the hardest hit by this pandemic. And we know this because of the need that we have seen with respect to food assistance, that so many families now really are struggling and making really difficult decisions about whether or not they pay utilities or they buy food. So the programs that we have really focused on, just to kind of reiterate what the senator said, is SNAP, an increase in the SNAP program, that we could go to the maximum benefit on the higher side of the SNAP benefit, and then to increase the minimum benefit from $16 to $30. So just imagine that we're giving people a benefit of just $16 during this time. So we know that when you increase SNAP, that SNAP has been the first line of defense for our country during tough economic times. We know that it is also a stimulus for our economy. But most importantly, for every meal that a food bank provides, SNAP can provide 9 meals. So we know that it is the most efficient way to quickly get food into the hands of the people who need it most. Secondly, we're very focused on pandemic EBT. That is a program that provides a benefit on the EBT card for families who have children who are in free and reduced price meals. So the value of those meals are placed on an EBT card, and they're able to use those cards at a grocery store to purchase food. That's really critical. And the reason that's critical is because we have seen how disruptive this pandemic has been, not only to incomes as it relates to job loss, but also as it relates to how we're able to best serve our children at meal sites. A lot of these first responders who are food nutrition workers sometimes contract the virus, and so they have to close down the school. So the best option for kids is to be able to use this EBT card while their school is temporarily closed down, their meal site is closed down. So we really recognize the importance of pandemic EBT. Currently, there are over 40 states who are implementing this program. And in the HEROES Act, we are requesting that it be extended and have additional supports. Also, with respect to pandemic EBT, we're also advocating for it to be made available to the kids of Puerto Rico who have been struggling through this pandemic as they've tried to figure out how to scale a meals program. So this is really critical and essential to ensure that our children have access to the best nutrition possible as they also try to fight this pandemic. We know how important it is when kids have access to nutrition, that their health outcomes improve, their educational outcomes improve, as well as their economic outcomes. And then finally, we're really pushing to make sure that the school nutrition budgets get some support. School nutrition budgets for schools sit outside of the general school budget. So they've really taken a hit. We know that a lot of them are operating in the red. We want to make sure that they're ready to go when kids are returning to school when it's safe, and that they can, again, be ready to operate. But, these school nutrition workers, as well as the staff up and down the chain, have been amazing in turning it around and making sure that kids have access. And we want to make sure that we support them so that they can be ready to operate efficiently and effectively in September, and to make sure that we continue to support them because they are the biggest provider of summer school meals right now while school is out. So those are the federal priorities that we're working on. We, of course, welcome everyone's support in this push, especially in passing the HEROES Act. And so at this point, I'll stop and leave it there.
Great, thank you. And now we're going to turn to Cory Williams, who's with the National Education Association, and she will cover some of the gaps we see and the needs we see for education programs. So thank you, Cory.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you to First Focus for inviting me today and to participating. And of course, kudos to Senator Van Hollen, who has been an incredible champion, not only for public education, but for kids and families. And he really did a fantastic job setting us up for this conversation today. The National Education Association represents 3 million educators, and there are more than 50 million students in education, K-12 and higher education throughout the country, and that's whom I work on behalf of. And so I wanted to speak a little bit today about the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, on federal funding to states and to public education, as those are really, really interlocked together. And to set the stage, Senator Van Hollen referenced budget as a moral document that reflects our country's priorities and where we invest. And so heading into this pandemic, I will just share that only 2 cents of every dollar of federal investment goes to public education. And that's pre-pandemic. And you'll hear me in a few moments talk about the systemic cuts we're anticipating to state budgets and to education budgets. And so we'll see what that impact is on that only 2 cents of every dollar of federal investment going to public education. So recently, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, or CBPP, estimated that state budget shortfalls over the next 3 years in response to this pandemic will total more than $765 billion. These states' fiscal crises really threaten cuts. They're really going to damage children's future. And absent further fiscal relief that Senator Van Hollen was talking about initially in the CARES Act and then also in the HEROES Act, in which we need to get moving in the Senate, states and localities will be forced to cut services, likely including services particularly important to children, such as K-12 public education and possibly others. What many people don't realize is public education comprises 30 to 40% of states' annual budgets. Therefore, making education a prime target for lawmakers at a time of big state budget shortfalls. And it is already happening. We're already hearing that school districts have already furloughed more than 760,000 employees over the last 3 months. We get reports in daily, and the numbers are increasing. And we've also learned from the damaging cuts to K-12 education in the Great Recession of 2008, if you are old enough to remember it, and that school districts have never fully recovered from the layoffs imposed back then, which leads me to today and the fiscal crisis facing K-12 public education brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. So public education, or America, is facing a projected shortfall of more than $200 billion for funding our schools. So remember, the states are looking at a projected shortfall of $765 billion, of which we make up 30 to 40% of their budget. And the schools themselves are looking at a more than $200 billion shortfall. Translated specifically into what that would mean for educators is one mechanism to measure. The NEA recently did just this week produce an analysis of what that would mean. So a $200 billion education shortfall would lead to a loss of nearly 2 million educator job losses, or 22% of educator jobs nationally, if we don't support our students with additional federal funding. And that is where the HEROES Act comes in that Senator Van Hollen mentioned. By comparison, going back and looking at 2008 financial crisis, I mean, we only lost more than about 300,000 educator jobs. So you can see, and in other words, the COVID-19 recession that we're looking at is projected to be more than 6 times as bad for students in public education as the not so distant 2008 financial crisis. And again, NEA released an estimate of the current state of education funding, and we use that by using CBPP's estimate of state shortfall, that's $780 billion, and looked at state fund revenues from the Census Bureau. We took into account, like we were being optimistic, we took into account that states spend all of their funding that they got through the CARES Act that was recently passed in March by Congress and passed into law that gave funding to states. And we also took into account that all states used their rainy day funds. Of course, states have differing rainy day funds, but they used all of it. We did not take into account the funds that states are getting through their state stabilization funds by the CARES Act, because education is one cost of many that are allowable use. So that doesn't mean that states have to use it for education. They can, but they don't have to, which is unfortunate. So if no additional federal funds are allocated in the upcoming emergency package, the HEROES Act, which got $90 billion for education in the House, and that is now sitting, gathering dust in the Senate, we would lose about 1.9 million educator jobs. And when I say educator jobs, I mean everyone who works in education: teachers, school counselors, school librarians, food service employees, bus drivers, everyone. And so if the HEROES Act were passed, as it is sitting at the Senate right now, with the $90 billion in additional education funding, that would, if all of that funding went specifically to education, would save more than 800,000 educator jobs, or nearly half of all of those lost, at all levels, from kindergarten to post-secondary. So as Senator Van Hollen said, we really hope the Senate takes up the bill and they at a minimum adhere to at least the $90 billion for education funding. And I'd be remiss if I also don't mention that we need additional funding. That funding would only go, if we were to calculate it only for educator jobs, we would get back about half we lost. We need additional funding for personal protective equipment for all of our educators and everyone who works in schools, for digital learning, which I'll talk about later and Senator Van Hollen touched upon, and also addressing the systemic underfunding of classrooms, in particular for students of color, before we can safely welcome our students back to school buildings. So, and simply maintaining social distancing in classrooms and school buses will require significant investments in education infrastructure and personnel to support students through the emotional and medical impacts of COVID, including their counselors and school nurses. And so we really need to ensure that our students have the resources they need and our educators have the resources they need, and we have educators that we need in the classroom as a result of these significant budget cuts that we're seeing in response to the pandemic. I'll stop there, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Cory, very much. Those are some staggering numbers, and we'll talk a little bit more about what it all means and what it means for the whole child as we get into the broader panel discussion here. But I want to pivot over to Lucy, who is with the National Association for the Education of Young Children, to talk about early ed and childcare needs. So thank you, Lucy, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for this opportunity to be part of today's panel. And also a note of gratitude to First Focus on Children and Senator Van Hollen for hosting today's important conversation. I am so thankful to be here and also to join in on this very important discussion that we are having today. As a member of the Children's Budget Coalition, NACCE is proud to be the professional membership organization for more than 60,000 individuals who care for, educate, and work on behalf of young children birth to age 8. As a membership organization, I have the immense privilege of hearing on a daily basis from childcare providers and early childhood educators across the country. Prior to the coronavirus pandemic, their stories were filled with appreciation for their work, alongside concerns associated with being part of an underpaid and unfortunately undervalued workforce, where families were already struggling with unaffordable child care options and insufficient and inadequate access to quality. Structural cracks and financial cliffs that have existed in the childcare industry, honestly, for decades. Yet COVID-19 has exacerbated the challenges programs are facing across all states and settings. Daily, I am confronted with desperate pleas for help as providers share heartbreaking and devastating stories about the blow the pandemic has had on their programs, as well as the children and families they serve. I have heard stories like that of Flora G., director and owner of Greenbelt Children's Center in Center Van Hollen, and also my home state of Maryland, for 30 years. For 30 years, Flora has run a NACI-accredited program serving children and families in Greenbelt, in the Greenbelt community. Earlier this year, Flora was filled with excitement and emotion as she was planning a community-wide celebration to commemorate this milestone. 30 years is overall so significant and important. However, today she is riddled with stress and anxiety about the reality her program is faced. Her program has been closed since March. She is not charging parents any fees, yet she continues to pay over $5,000 in rent, along with utilities and other operating expenses. She has had to furlough all her staff, including herself, and in the process is suffering the emotional toll of seeing the educators in her program struggling to make ends meet, children saddened by the rupture they've experienced from friends and beloved teachers, parents feeling overwhelmed, and the funding from the PPP loan she was able to finally receive quickly dwindling. And in the midst of all of that, understanding that the reality of opening back up and staying viable after opening feels more and more unattainable. Flora's story is not unique. Across the country, programs like hers that have served as anchors in their communities for 25, 40, 75, and more years are afraid they will not be able to survive this pandemic. Already, many have not. Facebook groups that have served as both learning and support spaces for childcare providers are being flooded with posts of infant and toddler-sized furniture that is now up for sale, leases for buildings or up for sales for buildings that once housed childcare programs, because now those programs have permanently closed their doors. For early childhood educators working in family childcare, the situation comes with its own set of heartbreaking challenges, as many are fearful of what will happen with their homes once rent and mortgage moratoriums end and they are expected to once again pay in full. A reality that, according to data from our partners at the National Association of Family Childcare, is burdening at least 46% of respondents to their latest survey who anticipate missing a mortgage payment without additional assistance. So I once again reiterate, these stories are not unique and are ones I have personally heard from providers across the country. From rural towns in Wisconsin, Texas, and Maine, to those in large urban cities like Los Angeles, Miami, and New York City. Pleas for help from providers in center-based programs that recently opened their small businesses, to those that have served generations of children in states like Alaska, North Carolina, Arkansas, Nebraska, and Colorado. The child care sector is in crisis. Results from surveys NACI has conducted show that nearly 50% of childcare programs in America say they have closed entirely and will not survive a closure of more than 2 weeks without financial support. This loss of childcare supply and could result in a permanent loss of nearly 4.5 million childcare slots. I'm going to reiterate and repeat that. With nearly 50% of childcare programs across the country saying that they have closed, this could lead to a potential loss and permanent loss of nearly 4.5 million childcare slots. The ripple effects of the devastating blow of the pandemic has had on childcare will reverberate across the country as states work to reopen and people look to return to work. None of this is possible without childcare. Childcare and early learning is a $99 billion industry that has always been and continues to be essential to supporting children, families, and the American economy. While the $3.5 billion included in the CARES Act for childcare and the creation of SBA loans like the PPP and EIDL programs have helped, there is still immense need. Without dedicated and targeted funding to stabilize the childcare industry and get money for childcare providers and early childhood educators who desperately need it, we risk to lose the backbone of our nation's response to disaster and the road to recovery. And so in today's conversation, I want to once again underline how important it is to ensure that as budget conversations are underway and as discussions are happening, we prioritize the need that our childcare providers and early childhood educators have expressed to be able to continue doing work that they are passionate about, that they are skilled and prepared to do, yet without our support, they will not continue to be able to do on behalf of children and families across this country. So thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing the conversation as part of the broader panel.
Great, thank you, Lucy. Thank you all. It's clear we have lots of work to do. So for the group, because I'm hoping that we can have a really good, robust dialogue here, and I know you all have plenty to add. But so we're at a point now where, as I mentioned, and the Senator spoke to this as well, appropriations committees are beginning or continuing, reinitiating their work on the FY21 annual spending bills. And we're also hoping that the Senate will quickly take up another emergency package, reflecting a lot of the good things that are in the HEROES Act. So I have a number of questions around that. But first, I think I want to ask, in your conversations with members of Congress and their staff, what are you hearing in terms of resistance for another emergency package? And what concerns are you picking up on in terms of FY21 funding, and in your responses to those concerns, what do you find is most compelling for them to hear from you? Did we lose everybody?
Nope, we're still here.
Okay.
So, Michelle, let me make sure I understand. So your first question was, what are we hearing about the movement of the HEROES package? And then what are some of our concerns about it, along with FY21 appropriations moving at the same time?
Right.
So I'm hearing that there is an acknowledgement by the administration and even in the Senate, both Democrats and Senate public acknowledgement by Republicans in additional investment, so additional dollars. What that looks like, we're not quite sure. I know that there's interest in the unemployment insurance benefit runs out at the end of July. There's interest in taking another look at that, depending on what the economy is. There are differing ideas about what to do. We're working hard to make the case that states need funding in order to fund many of the programs that we're talking about here, including public education, and that education itself needs additional education stabilization funding. And this isn't necessarily investment funding, this is emergency funding to keep us from falling farther behind, from losing educators, from reducing services to children. And so it puts us in a really interesting spot, while at the same time trying to talk about the budget for this next fiscal year, which starts October 1, especially layering in that it's an election year. So I'm also hearing that, well, we all know that it's been made clear that the Senate is scheduled to be on recess, or meaning not in their offices here in DC, the first 2 weeks of July. So that means, and then there's typically always an August recess, meaning they're away for the month of August. And during the election year, that's a really important time folks want to get home to campaign. So that means that since we're not hearing a lot of talk about this next HEROES package in the Senate, that it's probably going to happen in a very truncated period of time toward the end of July, and decisions are going to have to be made quickly. which is concerning, especially I think we have a really good sense of the breadth of need in order to ensure that children have access to nutrition and public education and housing and childcare, among so many other really challenging issues that have only been exacerbated, that were existingly there, but exacerbated by the pandemic.
If I can...
Go right ahead.
All right, so thank you, Monica. If I can just jump in and say, to underscore, I think something that Cory just said, what we are discussing and hearing right now, both from the stories that I have shared and have been hearing from the field, is this need for a bold funding to be able to stabilize the childcare sector. Similar to what Cory said about what's needed in public schools, right? We have seen that what is needed at this moment is emergency funding. It really is funding to be able to stabilize the sector and to be able to even envision what, longevity for the sector will look like in a couple of months from now. I think that what we saw in the HEROES Act was a good beginning, yet we still need significantly more funding in order to be able to provide that stabilization and that emergency funding. We have heard significant appetite, both from the Republican and the Democratic parties, to be able to provide the support with a resolution currently made available that is trying to address 25 billion for that. But we know, based on research that we have seen from partners, that really at least $50 billion is needed in order to be able to provide some of that stabilization that we have talked about. Again, to be able to meet the needs that child care providers have expressed because of decreased enrollments and also because of health requirements, just smaller class sizes. And so as these conversations are underway, I do feel that many members of Congress are hearing from their constituents about the impact that it will have on their lives and their ability to be able to return to work for those parents who have not been working. What it will mean for them to not have access to childcare. But I think also beyond the fact that this is something that is necessary for the road to recovery, it's also that this is an investment in children and in their development, in their growth, in the future of our country, to be able to make sure that we provide funding for the sector so that young children can have spaces where they are able to continue to learn and to develop and establish that foundation for learning that we know is so critical and important for them as they move forward in life. And so those are the pieces that we are hearing. There is this appetite, there is this interest, but we continue to underscore that there is this dire emergency in the immediate to be able to address this that requires then that emergency stabilization funding.
Thank you, Lizzie. Monica, did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to kind of build on what everyone has said, and not, and also to kind of go back to something Senator Van Hollen said, which is that, I think there's this wait and see approach on the Senate side, and particularly with Mr. McConnell. But, families can't wait and see. I think it's really important to recognize that, we have an increase in food insecurity among families and children. We have seen where and are currently estimating that 1 in 4 children are at risk of hunger since the pandemic. And what we know is that these supports are helping people to not spiral further into poverty or deeper into debt. And so we can't wait and see, and our children can't wait and see. And we really need to make sure that we are pushing really hard on the Senate to let them know that we're talking about families and that there are lots of things in the HEROES Act, whether it's for education or whether it's for childcare or child nutrition or other key support systems, that people cannot get back to work if the right supports are not in place. So we should invest and support them today and make sure that we are helping our children not fall farther behind, and making sure that they remain healthy during this time with proper nutrition. So, I think it's really important for us as advocates and for the rest of the advocates listening in that they hear from all of us and from all of you, because they need to understand that we cannot wait and see if our children are falling farther behind, or if they're hungrier, or if their health is outcomes are in jeopardy. So again, I think it's just really important that we continue to push really hard.
So I know nobody likes the bragger, but I would mention that as members of the Children's Budget Coalition, and this has, I think you all have touched on this, but when we're up on the Hill, I think we do a really good job sort of jumping off of each other's comments to make the point about the whole child, and that what we don't want to see is that we're going to take from an education program or a nutrition program to fund a healthcare program for kids. And we really try to make that case when we're up there, that it's all about the whole child. Like a hungry child isn't going to learn well, and an unhealthy child isn't going to learn well, and putting that message together, that all these different programs are so important, along with the fact that we need to reverse the trend, the downward trend in spending on kids programs. I mean, we're not keeping up with inflation, and both Bruce and the senator talked about this as well. So we really need to reverse that trend. And then going into the weeds a little bit, because I know you all will understand this, but two other things that we've been talking about. One, we often talk about making sure that the allocations to the subcommittees that have jurisdiction over a majority of the kids programs see healthy, robust allocations. We've had a little bit of luck recently, but as you all know, and maybe many of the people listening know, and the senator mentioned, we've really got a tight budget cap with a lot of competing interests for FY21. Even as we're, pushing to get the HEROES Act passed, if, as Cory, you're describing, we get to this point in July where the emergency package hasn't passed, which is a scary thought, and the appropriations bills are moving, I think there will be hopefully a strong attempt to put some emergency relief in any of the annual spending bills that move. But I don't have a crystal ball that tells me that. I think we're picking up on that a little bit in our travels on the Hill. So hopefully you all can join some of us. We've got another call with Senator Bunt's staff coming up on Monday. So all the work you're doing and participating in the coalition efforts is greatly appreciated. I wanted to, did anybody have anything else they wanted to add to sort of that? Because then I was going to move over to the CARES Act and the HEROES Act. Are there some major gaps and holes in the CARES Act that are in the HEROES Act in your area that you would identify for those listening that are critically important for the healthy development of children? You're all smiling.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Monica.
Yeah, I think, when the CARES Act was first enacted, and even the Families First, we were still kind of trying to figure out what the overall impact was going to be. And we were definitely in response mode without an idea of how long this would continue. And I think that what the HEROES Act has done in terms of addressing some of the gaps is definitely with respect to pandemic EBT, in trying to provide additional funding for states to cover the administrative costs, as well as to try to streamline some of the requirements around pandemic EBT. In addition, it also includes language, the HEROES Act does include language that would do a feasibility study to help and determine whether or not Puerto Rico can come on board with offering pandemic EBT. So I think that there's some key provisions like that that are really helpful. There's also funding in the HEROES Act that's not in the CARES Act. With respect to school nutrition budgets, I think nobody really anticipated how long and what the need would continue to be. And I think from our perspective, we're also looking to see if there's anything else that needs to be added to the HEROES Act in the way of USDA authority and flexibilities, because I think we thought by September we might be going back to school and things might have some sense of what it looks like, a little sense of normalcy. But I think we all recognize that that is not happening. It's not gonna be business as usual, and we're gonna have to see what things look like when kids do return to schools, when it's safe, and what the needs are. But I think, you know, we have been advocating for a child nutrition reauthorization bill that would include non-congregate authorities and actually summer EBT. And so what we're seeing playing out now is that, you know, those are key provisions that are necessary to help feed kids through the pandemic. So I think trying to assess what the needs are, but there are definitely some things in the HEROES Act that were not in the CARES Act, like pandemic EBT being available for Puerto Rico and extending pandemic EBT through FY21, and funding for school nutrition budgets, as well as the SNAP increases. And so all of those are really critical to making sure that kids have access to food.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, there's one area that is glaringly missing from the CARES Act that is really unfortunate, given, I think as Monica just articulated, what we're looking at as the likely scenario for kids going back to school in the fall, with a variety of models of blended learning, some in-class time, some remote or distance learning from home to accommodate social distancing and cleaning of schools, and to also accommodate potential resurgences of the pandemic. And so what that is addressing the homework gap. The homework gap is experienced by at least 12 million students in the country, and it was here before the pandemic started. That's why it's called the homework gap. It was students that go home after school and don't have access to the internet, even though more than 70% of educators assign homework or schoolwork that require the internet. And so the pandemic really shone a bright light on this glaring inequity for kids that didn't have access at home. And so what that means now is, in the last several months, without that internet access and devices, it's not necessarily a homework gap, it's the going to school gap. And what's really unfortunate about this is, according to a 2018 Pew Research Center report, the homework gap afflicts minority households disproportionately, with 25% of all Black households with school-aged children and 23% of Hispanic households with school-aged children lacking high-speed internet access. Also, rural students face significant homework gap challenges, with 37% of rural Americans having no broadband access at home. Also, the homework gap hits low-income families particularly hard, with more than 1/3 of households with school-aged children that earn less than $30,000 lacking high-speed internet. And so as we look to fall, without high-speed internet and devices, we have a school gap. So back in March, I created a coalition that's now more than 60 national education and related organizations, including First Focus, to advocate for what Senator Van Hollen referred to as a bill that he has introduced along with Senator Markey, a $4 billion fund, because that's about the cost we think it'll take for this next year, to create a special fund to be administered through the Federal Communication Commission's E-rate program that provides connectivity to schools anyway, to equip students with hotspots and devices and internet service, actually the service to devices, through the school year. And so every child would have access to a classroom, whether it's at school or remotely from home. And we think that this is a really key component, that we need this dedicated homework gap funding in the HEROES Act when it passes, in order to level the playing field, ensure that every student has an equitable access to school, no matter what that looks like.
So that's something that needs to be added to, in addition to what's in HEROES. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and it's there. So it is in. So it's a component that is in the HEROES Act that was passed at the House. However, the House, here's a little bit of funniness. The House appropriated funding for it for $1.5 billion. However, funding was authorized by the Commerce Committee, who oversees this area, at $5 billion.
Okay.
You know, so that's a whole nother story in itself. We need at least $4 billion. And the Senate bill that Senators Van Hollen and Markey introduced recently for $4 billion has all Democratic senators except one and the independent senators as original co-sponsors, including Minority Leader Schumer and the ranking member of the Commerce Committee, Cantwell. So it is the solution that the Democratic leadership is all in on, and we're working really hard to get our Republican counterparts there as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Lucy, did you want to add on the childcare front? And
Absolutely.
And the other thing is, if you don't mind, Lucy, talking a little bit more, I know you mentioned it, but a little bit more, just how incredibly vital childcare is for us as we hopefully start picking up the pace in the economic recovery, although there's a lot of uncertainty there. But just if people are going back to work, they know they can put their children in a safe place. So appreciate what you can share with us on that.
No, absolutely. And I do think that, just to touch upon something that was mentioned earlier, right? When we talk about young children, right? We talk about children not existing in a vacuum. They are part of communities and they are part of families. And so healthy children, healthy families, healthy communities are all integrated. A child that is faced with hunger insecurity is definitely a child that is unable to be able to show up as their full selves, to learn and to be able to continue just their education process, right? And so while we may be representing Monica, Cory, and myself, 3 different organizations, at the core, when we're talking about children, right, these issues are all intertwined and they are interconnected. And so in many ways, we are not advocating for a separation of, we need to prioritize one over the other. But in reality, it really is that all of these are necessary so that we can continue to support young children. I do feel that what we saw in the CARES Act, again, particularly the resources that were allocated specifically for childcare, have been helpful, and they have provided some support for the childcare sector. However, there is still this incredible need that we have heard and we have seen from providers across the country. The HEROES Act does provide a starting point for that, but even that does not meet the need that we know is there. We have heard, and again, our survey data just reinforces this, that we need emergency funding. We need stabilization funds to be able to continue to have a sector that will be there to support families as those that have stayed at home return to work, and those that are considered essential workers and have relied on childcare can continue to have that support moving forward. Currently, there is a bill, the Child Care is Essential Act, that provides that emergency funding and stabilization that we are talking about, right? This is specific to childcare. $50 billion in funding that is dedicated, it's dedicated grants that child care providers will be able to utilize for things like personnel costs, sanitation and cleaning, training and professional development, fixed costs, mental health supports for children and employees, right? I think that is something that we also are very cognizant of. I mentioned this in my opening remarks, that rupture that children are experiencing from so many changes, so many different environments that they now find themselves, different realities, and then what ramifications will that have in their development, but also on the employees themselves, right? Oftentimes we hear early childhood educators being referred to as essential, and we know that they're essential. However, they are treated as expendable. they are treated as if the work that they do is not worth investing in. And so what impact that has on their own well-being, and also the reality that most of the early childhood workforce, the average wage for an early childhood educator is $10.70, right? So we're talking about also the pernicious impact of poverty on this workforce. And so there are many things that I think we have now an opportunity, as devastating as it may be that it has come to light in the midst of this pandemic, to truly address some deep changes that need to happen to the structure of childcare and to the infrastructure of childcare. And so while the HEROES Act is a beginning to that, and again, I mentioned the fact that there is bipartisan support. So we do have a resolution with Senators Ernst and Sinema that both, it's a bipartisan $25 billion to be able to start to address this need, but there is just significantly more that is needed beyond what has been allocated in the HEROES Act. And we are seeing that, at least in the child care front, through the Child Care is Essential bill that will provide $50 billion, again, as emergency funding and also stabilization that the sector desperately needs.
Thank you for that. I want to go back to the comment you made, Cory, about schools getting ready. And even if, and I think, Monica, you said this, it isn't business as usual. I have a few teacher friends here in town in DC, and I've been talking to them about what it may or may not look like. And some of my colleagues are parents, and just what we're talking about when this new school year starts. And one of my friends was explaining just the laundry list, which is important, of things that need to change in the schools if kids are physically coming back to the classroom, from the need to make sure you're wiping down the handrails and the bathroom and just all these different things. And then if we're looking at a childcare system that can't, just isn't at the ready to support maybe half school weeks and things like that. Can you all just sort of talk about what you're hearing from your members in your organizations and your community partners, and how things hopefully can come together? And especially if we push hard and see something along the lines of the HEROES Act pass soon.
If I may, sorry, Cory, and I'll be very brief with this, but this is something that we are hearing across the board, right? Childcare is necessary for individuals who are working and looking to return to work if they have been in stay-at-home orders, for those who are feeling the stress of working from home and also having to provide childcare, unsure how to be able to best meet the needs of the children, of their own children. But one of the things that we are hearing even more so is, because there is so much uncertainty around what education will look like for the older age children, many members of the workforce are also struggling with their own ability to find childcare for their own children, as they are looking to provide it for other families, right? So there is this tension between the fact that childcare is it's an industry that supports multiple workforces, and ultimately we say that it is the backbone to our economy, because it allows for parents and families to be able to return to work, to return to school if they're pursuing higher education, right? To be able to care for other family members or loved ones if they are primary caregivers to other adults. And so what we are seeing is that there is a deep concern from members, again, of communities across the country, where before we would talk about childcare deserts, if we have this reduced capacity of programs that permanently close, it will exacerbate this problem. It will create challenges and issues. And just this week, different chambers of commerce across the country, over 30 of them, sent a letter to Congress articulating exactly the same point, that they have a concern because many of these childcare programs are small businesses, many of them minority owned, that if they close and they create then this void in terms of care, how that will impact, and again, the ripple effect that will have across our economy.
Great. Thank you for that. Yeah. Cory, you have something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're right on point, and colleagues of mine at the School Superintendents, the American Association of School Superintendents, as well as ASBO, the American Society of School Business Officers, I don't know if I have that quite right, have just in the last week, I think on Monday, put out an infographic where they did an analysis of what the cost would be. Thank you, Tim, for putting it up. What the cost would be to reopen schools. And it averaged, and taking into account, and I'll just tell you what these 4 categories are: adhering to health and monitoring and cleaning and disinfecting from electrostatic disinfectant sprays, no-touch thermometers, hand sanitizer, disinfectant wipes, deep cleaning of schools, to hiring staff to implement healthy safety measures, ensuring that there's a school nurse in every school, which we should have anyway, and then providing personal protective equipment for everyone, as well as thinking about transportation and childcare. And so on average, and granted this is an average, costs are differ between rural and urban schools and whatnot and sizes. On average, it'll cost $1.8 million for every school district to implement these, adhering to what the CDC recommends as guidelines. So that's a staggering sum. So we're looking at not only the cost of education and childcare and food security, but also then just the physical safety and putting health priorities of our students and educators front and center. Another $1.8 million per school district.
Did that include hiring people if they need them, Cory? Sorry, I was trying to read.
So this includes ensuring at least 1 school nurse is in every public school, and ensure it includes, additional, someone in every school bus to screen kids and to ensure they're adhering to safe practices. So it's not totally comprehensive because that just gets completely overwhelming, but it's really, if you follow the CDC guidelines, this is what you need.
Okay.
So we need more funding.
Yeah.
and to everyone else's point that has been made very, very clearly, this is emergency funding. Unfortunately, we really don't see right now new opportunities for, aside from public interest, and especially in light of what's happened in the last several weeks, looking to basic social safety nets and supports, like childcare and food security and public education as great equalizers that every family and every child, no matter where you live or the color of your skin, should have equitable access to. So there's renewed interest, but we need to get that to translate into the dollars that will be passed in the HEROES Act, fortunately or hopefully, in order to really just stabilize the current situation, not even make real gains.
Yeah. Monica, do you have something to add on the food delivery front there in terms of safety?
Yeah, I would like to build on something that Lucy said, and that is that, that these workers, especially school nutrition workers and childcare workers, are essential. And I want to sort of highlight something and build off of something that Cory also said, that this is emergency funding, and that's a shame. That, trying to meet the needs of children is emergency funding versus us really just investing in kids. And I think as we go forward and we see, how we're going to have to feed children when they go back to school, it may not be in the cafeteria, and our schools equipped to do that. Our schools equipped and have all the refrigerators necessary to be able to keep the food and the type of food that they're going to be able to serve under this kind of new scenario. But I also want to go back to something that Cory also touched on, and that is the equity aspect of all of this. We know that it's been low-income families, families of color, who have really bared the burden of all of this pandemic. And I think that, when we talk about, what kids need in terms of being able to go pick up a meal, that some of their family members, their parents, were actually essential workers and could not necessarily show up at a meal site. So we had to get different flexibilities to be able to allow a grandparent or a parent to show up and pick up multiple meals without the child present. So I think as we think about this going forward, I think we have to keep in mind who has been hardest hit by this and what are the policies and how do we deliver education, childcare, and food to kids in a way that is equitable and accessible. More importantly, accessible. And, I think that there are a lot of children who it wasn't not just having the equipment, they probably did not have the equipment or the access, but keeping in mind that they're probably having to provide childcare to other siblings while their parents are essential workers working somewhere else, and that there was limited resources available. So, there is a lot here that we will not solve today. But I think as we continue to go forward and we think about this, that we have to consider every single aspect and challenges and barriers that exist for a lot of low-income families and families of color.
Thank you for that, Monica. I wholeheartedly agree with you on that. I know we're running short on time, but I am going to put one last thing out there. And Lucy, you and I talked about this briefly in preparation for our dialogue today. But we are in the middle of the 2020 census. And that is critically important for the distribution of hundreds of billions of federal dollars. And I just wanted to make that point that it's really and we have undercounted kids in the past historically, and we certainly, that happened in 2010. And we need to make sure we count all kids because that matters in terms of how all those federal dollars are distributed. And so I just, it's a budget related one to close on, and I know the Children's Budget Coalition has done some work on this, but if any of you wanted to comment on that, because it's also so important for low-income households and families of color.
No, absolutely. And the census is definitely something that is very dear and close to my heart, because oftentimes people don't realize how many children have been undercounted in the past, and that it is a trend that has been historically increasing over the course of the years. And so we, as a part of the Count All Children Committee, we have really been emphasizing the need for all young children, especially babies and toddlers, to be counted in the census. We know that census data is used for important things that we have touched upon today, SNAP, housing, assistance for low-income housing, for childcare programs, right? For a number of those different support systems that we know are integral to the development of children. And the reality is that once a child is missed in the census and they are an infant, a baby, a toddler, it will be 10 years before they are counted again. And so that means that their entire childhood, really, they are experiencing it without being counted, without using that data to really allocate the funding that we know is so necessary. And so as many of us find ourselves still at home, I encourage individuals to take those 10 minutes to go online or to call or to fill out the census that was mailed to their homes, to really ensure that we are counting all children, again, babies, infants, toddlers, to make sure that our communities receive the supports that are so desperately needed, as so much of these funding decisions made on Capitol Hill rely on census data.
Thank you for that. And being mindful of time here, because we're 2 minutes over according to my clock, I want to thank you all so very much for today's very thoughtful and thought-provoking discussion. I really appreciate everything you all do, and working with you. It is helpful to know that I have such strong child advocate partners to rely on and to do good work. So thank you all very much. Another thank you to the Senator and his staff, and have a great afternoon and weekend. Take good care.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.